Good morning, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us for the 2022 Pennsylvania Budget and Policy Summit. My name is Jeff Garris. I am the Federal Campaigns and Program Director here at the Pennsylvania Budget and Policy Center, where one of the things that I do is I help to coordinate our annual Budget Summit. It's worth noting that our annual Budget Summit is now in its teen years. We sometimes debate exactly which year it is, but we are well into the teen years. So you are meeting our Budget Summit here at a great time. This is also the third year that we are having our Budget Summit virtually because of the pandemic. It was a bit of a surprise the first year. We had to make some last minute changes. Last year we had time to plan as we did this year. And we're very excited about the Budget Summit that we're presenting this year and that we are beginning here today with this session. The theme for this year's Budget Summit is Advancing Democracy for Pennsylvania's Future. When we talk about this theme, we're talking about putting into place the policies that are supported by and that benefit the overwhelming majority of Pennsylvanians. These are policies like quality education that's fairly and equitably funded, access to affordable housing, healthcare, the kind of things that a wide majority of us support. Fixing our upside down tax system so that the super rich start to pay their fair share, and investing these funds in the services that we all need, in building the infrastructure that we need now and in the future, in good paying union jobs, and in creating a clean energy economy. Even more fundamentally though, we're talking about the idea of defending our very democracy against efforts to undermine and negate it. And instead we want to expand it and ensure that everyone has every opportunity to make their voice heard and to participate fully in the decisions that impact all of us. Indeed, we are talking about advancing democracy for Pennsylvania's future. You're going to be hearing about this theme in this morning's opening plenary session and in this afternoon's keynote speech, and in the summit sessions that will take place on the next 3 Thursday afternoons. We'll be talking more and giving you some previews of what's coming up next later on today. All of these sessions feature experts in policy and advocacy who can help us to really think through how is it that we advance democracy for Pennsylvania's future. We're really excited to begin the summit with this plenary session, which provides an in-depth overview of Governor Wolf's proposed 2022-2023 state budget, and looking also at the challenges and the opportunities facing Pennsylvania in 2022 and beyond. Just this morning, we released our budget analysis. It is available right now on the PBPC website. We're going to drop that link in the chat so you can follow along. That is newly released, and that's what we're going to be looking at today. For the last few weeks, since the governor's budget address back at the beginning of February, our research and policy analysis team has been analyzing the governor's budget proposal to produce this analysis. And this morning, we're going to be looking very closely at some of the key findings and recommendations in that analysis. We're very pleased this morning to be hearing from some of the folks from our research team. We're hearing from Pennsylvania Budget and Policy Center Director Marc Stier, as well as Senior Policy Analyst Diana Polson. I want to welcome all of you to the Budget Summit, and I especially want to welcome Marc Stier and Diana Polson as they lead this opening plenary session. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Jeff. Let's launch the PowerPoint, and then I will go into the beginning of the budget analysis. I want to thank everyone for being here today. We really appreciate your presence. This is the longest part of the program, not necessarily in hours, but in detail. I'm going to start and give you an overview of the budget, and then Diana's going to walk you through some of the critical components of the budget, areas where we particularly focus on: education, higher education, human services, and environmental programs. Let's go to the next slide. Let me start with a broad picture. As you know, this is Governor Wolf's last budget, and every news report on the subject said just that. Governor Wolf's last budget. It's not a budget that's very different from previous budgets in some ways. Rather than look at it as the governor's last budget, I want to look at it in a different way. This is the last chance for the General Assembly to embrace Governor Wolf's priorities, which also happen to be the priorities of the people of Pennsylvania, as every meeting we have around the state shows, and as all the polls show. People in Pennsylvania want a fair and adequate education at all levels, K-12, pre-K, higher education. They want us to protect the vulnerable members of our society. And they want to see the environment protected and us prepare for climate change. Those have been the governor's priorities since he took office. They remain his priorities. You'll see in our analysis that there's going to be a lot of continuity between what the governor's proposed this year and what he's proposed in previous years. And we think that's appropriate because, as I said, these are the priorities of the people of Pennsylvania. Unfortunately, our General Assembly, which, as you know, has been heavily gerrymandered over the last 20 years, has a majority that does not necessarily support all these priorities. And I think it's time for the people of Pennsylvania to demand of our legislators of both parties that they embrace these priorities and move some of them forward this year. There's some differences in this budget, differences that might enable us to actually make more progress than we've had in previous years. First, there's more attention to environmental concerns. The governor has embraced the regional greenhouse gas initiative, and which will, over the long term, reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by 30%. And there's a lot of federal funding available for environmental programs. The governor is taking advantage of that funding and using it to expand and to some extent make up for the cuts that we've seen over the past 20 years in environmental programming. And most importantly, there's no proposal for new tax revenue. As we'll see in just a minute, there's no need for a proposal for new tax revenue because the state is flush with cash. We're sitting on a lot of money that can be used to embrace the governor's priorities. And that's one reason, as I mentioned, that we're somewhat optimistic that this is a year where the General Assembly could, if it wanted, embrace some of the governor's priorities and do it without raising taxes. And that's why we're going to ask you throughout this whole budget summit, not just today, but over the next 3 weeks, to be ready to take your part in making a good budget for Pennsylvania by asking legislators to embrace the governor's priorities. So let's go on to the next slide where we can see a general overview of the budget. Now here's where we get into some of the wonky details. We're going to be talking today about the general fund budget mostly. The general fund, however, is only part of the whole state operating budget. In addition to the general fund, there are about 200 special funds. Most of them get revenues from very special places targeted to the uses of those funds. And most of them are quite small. There are a couple that are larger. The two biggest ones are the motor license fund and the lottery fund. The general fund, Governor Wolf is proposing a $43.7 billion budget. The motor license fund is $3 billion, the lottery fund, $2 billion. All the other 200 some odd funds come out to another $19 billion. And this is all state money. In addition to all the state money, the state spends about $41 billion in federal funds, which are appropriated by the United States Congress and flow through the state. Sometimes they flow through the state in very dedicated ways. For example, Medicaid reimbursements, which we get from the federal government, account for between 50 and 56% of our Medicaid expenditures. That money has to be used for Medicaid and is dependent on the state doing its share, doing its part in funding the Medicaid program. Other federal funds are more general, and the governor and the General Assembly have some ability to target those funds in different ways. So the total of all these funds is $109 billion in the fiscal year, the next fiscal year, which is what the governor's proposal is focused on. In the next slide, we see overall trend in state spending. We've been showing this slide over the last couple of years, partly because we want to rebut a claim often made by critics of Pennsylvania's government, who say that the state government is growing larger and larger. It's taking up more of our economic space. It's employing more and more people. They talk about the state government as if it's a giant leviathan that's going to take over our lives. In fact, the general fund has been shrinking as a share of the gross state product since Governor Corbett took office. That's 12 years ago. If you look at those 12 years and you compare them to the 15 years before that, when we had both Democratic and Republican governors, you'll see that general fund expenditures have averaged between 8 and 12% less in this most recent period than in the previous period. That is 8 to 12% less in the last 12 years compared to the 15 years before that. That's a trend we expect to continue. Now you'll see there's a blip in the current fiscal year and proposed for the next fiscal year where expenditures have gone up. That's largely a product of pandemic-related expenditures, emergency funds that have been used to deal with the problems of the pandemic. Once those funds are spent, we expect the downward trend to continue, and thus we expect the state government to shrink as a share of gross state product. While that shrinking has been going on, we've also seen employees drop in the state government, and even more in state-funded local expenditures, such as education. When Governor Corbett cut $1 billion of education funding, we saw a $27,000 cut in teachers and guidance counselors, 27,000 person cut in teachers and guidance counselors and school nurses and librarians and so forth. The state government hasn't been shrinking that much, but it has become smaller in terms of the number of employees. And there may be a slight upturn this year, but again, the long-term trend is downwards. And that should worry us because while we often talk about budget deficits, the most serious deficits that state faces is a public investment deficit, a lack of funding in K-12 education, in higher education, in environmental protection, and in human services. And that's something we've documented over the last 5 or 6 years. It's something we document in detail in our budget analysis today. If we go to the next slide, you'll see one of the big differences in the economic situation of the state compared to previous years. The General Assembly has a lot of money. There's a big state surplus, and that gives the state an opportunity to, as we say, go big, to make major investments in some of the things I've been talking about. Now, why is there such a big surplus? Well, there are basically 5 reasons. Number one, the budget passed last June for the current fiscal year. As you probably know, the state budget year starts on July 1st and ends on June 30th. So the current fiscal year budget proposed a $2.5 billion surplus. That surplus was largely created by an infusion of $3.8 billion in American Rescue Plan funds. In addition to that projected surplus, the fast economic recovery since the COVID has led to a projected additional $2.2 billion in revenues. Now that fast recovery is largely a product of federal spending, of the American Rescue Plan, and before that of the CARES Act. 18 months ago, we expected a long, difficult recovery from what was the worst economic downcline since the Great Depression. And that was created by COVID-19, as you know. Because of huge influx of federal funds in the CARES Act and the American Rescue Plan, our economy has been growing much faster. Now we know that's led to some inflation. We're not going to talk about that today, although we may talk about it at one of the panels later in the budget summit. But we expect that inflation to subside very soon. The most important thing to remember, however, is the huge influx of funds has led to a huge economic recovery that's driven down unemployment and led to a lot more state revenues than we originally expected. So we're expecting right now $2.2 billion in additional revenues beyond the $2.5 billion that were projected, and that could grow even higher. Third source of the surplus is the rainy day fund. We put $2.6 billion in the rainy fund at the end of the previous fiscal year. That was because we ran a surplus as the economy was recovering in the second half of that fiscal year. There's $2.2 billion in remaining American Rescue Plan funds that have not been spent. And then there's been a further reduction in expenditures because FMAP has been increased. Now, FMAP is the federal share of our Medicaid spending. Usually, the federal government pays about 50% of the cost of Medicaid in the state. And as we'll see, Medicaid is a major part of our budget. Because of the health emergency, the federal share has been increased by 6.2 percentage points. So the federal government has been paying 56% of our Medicaid expenditures rather than about 50%. And that over a course of a year, that adds $2.4 billion to our budget. Now, we expected the health emergency to continue through the first half of the current fiscal year. It's now been continued through the whole fiscal year, and thus we're projecting another $1.2 billion in reduced expenditures, which will, of course, create a surplus at the end of the year. And that means that in total, if you add up these 5 lines, the state is expected to have a $10.7 billion surplus at the end of the current fiscal year. That's a huge amount of money, particularly when you consider that over the last 8 years, we've been struggling every year to balance our budget. This gives us an opportunity to make major investments in education, higher education, and other parts of the state budget, human services, and environmental protection. The governor proposes to make some really big investments, which we'll be talking about. But one thing I want you to know is, even with those investments, our back the envelope projection is that at the end of the fiscal year for which governor proposes the budget, that is at the end of June 2023, we would still have an $8.8 billion surplus to continue spending at the level the governor proposes in this budget. So let's go on to the next slide and take a look at the American Rescue Plan funding that the governor is also proposing. Now, this is outside the budget, but it is an important part of the governor's program. The governor is basically proposing a new plan. We've named it Brighter PA, and that plan proposes to spend $1.7 billion in a number of different areas of American Rescue Plan money. And that's why it's technically outside the budget. And I just want to review this plan because it hasn't got enough attention, and it's something we strongly support. There are about 6 elements of the plan. I'm going to go over them relatively quickly. The first is what the governor calls the PA Opportunity Program. It'll provide help to about 3 million Pennsylvanians, those with low incomes, providing a family for an average of close to $700. This plan will help Pennsylvanians deal with the higher costs they face as the economy returns to normal and help those who suffered the most as a result of the pandemic. A second part of the program is a $204 million investment in the property tax rebate program. That'll give a one-time bonus to both renters and homeowners with low incomes. The program will give an estimated 466,000 Pennsylvanians an additional average rebate of $475. A third element of the program is $225 million to the COVID relief statewide small business assistance program, which will provide grants ranging from $5,000 to $55,000 to 11,000 small businesses that have been hurt by the pandemic. Businesses can use these grants to cover operating expenses and to access technical assistance. The program will prioritize women and minority-owned businesses in rural communities. Then there's a $50 million investment in the county mental health workforce. As you know, mental health issues have been exacerbated by the pandemic. This $50 million investment will help Pennsylvanians all over the state get the mental health care they need during this difficult time. Another element of the program is an expansion of the Pennsylvania Higher Education Assistance Agency, a student loan forgiveness program for nurses, to additional healthcare workers. The program provides student loan relief up to $2,500 for each year of working this critical field, for up to a 3-year benefit of $7,500. As you probably have heard, we're facing a shortage of nurses in the state and other healthcare providers. And the reason, of course, is people are burned out because of the enormous demands the pandemic has placed on them. So this program would give loan forgiveness to people who are are currently engaged in education for nursing and other health-related professions, or who have recently completed that education. We think that's a critical thing for the government to be doing right now. Finally, the plan proposes $450 million in new funding for the Growing Greener Conservation and Recreation Program, as well as for agricultural conservation programs, such as the Agricultural Conservation Assistance Program and the existing Agricultural Conservation Excellence Grant Program. After experiencing record-breaking rainfall and flooding events in the last 18 months, this program would make Pennsylvania more resilient to extreme and frequent weather events caused by climate change. These are the basic elements of the Brighter PA plan, a plan to spend $1.7 billion of the remaining ARP funding. We strongly support this plan. We've had a very hard time convincing Republicans to use American Rescue Plan money. They want to keep holding it for further purposes, basically for the purposes of paying tax cuts they passed in the last decade. We think now's the time to be investing in Pennsylvanians. We think now's the time to be spending more to keep our economic recovery so that we don't have to worry as much about deficits in the future. The next slide shows you the overall spending on the American Rescue Plan. You'll see that the ARP funds already allocated are in the blue, dark blue on the right. That's $5,100, $5.1 billion rather. And the parts of the Brighter PA plan are in the brighter colors on the left. Let's go on to start talking about some of the details of the general fund. One important feature of our tax system is that it's grossly unfair. We've talked about this before, and we're going to keep talking about it until we fix it. If you look at what share of income people in different income groups pay, you'll see that at the bottom 20%, which is people who make on average $13,000 a year, the top income for a family in the bottom 20% is about $21,000 a year. 13.8% of income goes to state and local taxes. If you look at the middle 20%, with an average income of about $54,000 a year, about 11.1% of people's income goes to state and local taxes. Sorry again. If you look at the top 1%, where people have an average income of $1.6 million a year, only 6% of their income goes to state and local taxes. This is a totally upside down system. It should be at least flat or reversed. People with higher incomes really should be paying a higher share of their income in state and local taxes. We are one of the 10 worst states in terms of tax inequity, and it's really time to fix it. As many of you know, the real problem is we have a personal income tax that is flat and too low. We have proposed something we call a fair share tax that would increase taxes on the top 1% and lower taxes on about 50% of Pennsylvanians. It's time to move forward with that fair share tax proposal. Another problem with our taxes is our corporate taxes. Let's go to the next slide. Corporate taxes and business taxes generally are providing a smaller share of general fund revenues over time. Back in 1972, 30% of our state general fund budget came from corporate taxes. That's down to 15% right now. That's a terrible reversal. It has not led to any great increase in economic growth or job creation, and it's really time to reverse that as well. Unfortunately, the governor this year is proposing a corporate tax plan that we think will actually make things worse. Let's go to the next slide and take a look at it. The governor is proposing a reduction of the corporate net income tax from 9.99% to 7.99% on January 1st, 2023, with further gradual reductions to 4.99%. This would cost the state more than $2 billion over 5 years. In the 5th year alone, it would cost $645 million, and in future years, even more. Now, we've supported some reduction in the corporate income tax rate because it is higher than average, and because that tax right now falls mainly on Pennsylvania-based corporations. The national average is not that much lower than our average. It's about 7%. And we've called for reducing the corporate income tax to about 6.5%, which is what business profits would be taxed under our fair share tax proposal if they're not organized in the corporate form. But we've also said that if we're going to reduce our tax rates, we need to move to something called combined reporting. Now, you've probably heard me talk about the Delaware loophole many times before. And so you know that 73% of corporations that operate in Pennsylvania, multi-state and multinational corporations, do not pay any corporate taxes to Pennsylvania. They do that because of what we call the Delaware loophole, and now we've also started calling it the Cayman Islands loopholes because of international tax evasion. Basically, Pennsylvania affiliates of large multi-state multinational corporations show no profits in our state. Well, how do they do that? Because they pay the multinational corporations for goods and services, for advertising, for trademarks, for use of brands, for advertising costs, and they deduct that from their Pennsylvania profits, so they show no profits. In past years, the governor's called for something called combined reporting. Now, what that would do would say, if you make 10% of your sales worldwide in Pennsylvania, then 10% of your profits should be apportioned to Pennsylvania and taxed in our state. If you make 1.2% of your sales in Pennsylvania, 1.2% of your profits nationwide or globally should be taxed in Pennsylvania. This is what 26 states does, and it's how you create a fair tax system. However, this year, the governor's not calling for combined reporting, mostly because the Chamber of Commerce and other business interests keep opposing it. Instead, he's calling for what we call add backs. That is saying some of those deductions that you take for payment to your affiliates outside of Pennsylvania, you need to add them back into your income. He's calling for add backs for management fees, intercompany royalties, and intercompany interests. We think those would be a good addition to our tax system, but they're far inferior to combined reporting. Whenever you have an add back like this, it's like playing whack-a-mole. You close one loophole, but you leave opportunities for corporations to find other loopholes. And while the add backs may increase tax revenues a bit in the near term, over the long term, we don't expect it to add a lot of tax revenue because corporations will find other ways to escape taxation in Pennsylvania. So we strongly oppose this proposal. We think there's no real economic benefit to corporate tax reductions. And we think it's unfair and also undemocratic that giant multinational corporations would still pay so little in Pennsylvania state taxes, while corporations based in our state, who presumably are the constituents of the General Assembly, would still be paying far more. So you'll be hearing us talking about this corporate income tax proposal throughout the year, and we're going to be encouraging you to oppose it. Let's go on to the next slide. We're going to now move to talk about the minimum wage, and I'm going to go over this in fairly quickly. It's something we've talked about many times before, but I want to give you some bare outlines of the situation. As the next slide shows, Pennsylvania remains the only state in our region, and one of the fewer states in the whole country that has not raised its minimum wage in many, many years. It's now 11 years, not 10, since we've been stuck at $7.25. And that's the federal minimum wage. We last increased our state minimum wage 14 years ago to $7.15. The next slide shows you the governor's proposal, which echoes things he's proposed before. He proposed an immediate increase to $12 in July, with 50-cent increases yearly, taking us to $15 by 2028. By the way, we think it's time to start thinking about a minimum wage higher than $15. The governor proposes a one fair wage, eliminating the tip minimum wage of $282.83 an hour. He proposes cost of living increases once we get to $15 an hour. And he wants to end local preemption, which stops county and city governments around the state from raising the minimum wage above the state level if they think it's appropriate in their area. We strongly support all of these proposals. The next slide will show you some of the people who benefit from the minimum wage. Women make up about 60% of workers who would benefit from a wage increase to $15 an hour by 2028. Next slide looks at some other people who would benefit. One of the myths about the minimum wage is that most minimum wage workers are teenagers, but if we raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour, less than 15% of the workers who would be impacted that are teenagers. 31% are over 40, 53% are between 19 and 40. Many of them have children. Many of them are single mothers or single fathers. All these people deserve a raise, and it's time to raise the minimum wage to benefit them. Next slide. And it's particularly important to do it because many of the people who would benefit from raising the minimum wage are essential workers. People who have gotten us through the pandemic, people in healthcare, education, restaurants, accommodation, and trade. They make up nearly 3/4 of the workers who would see benefit from raising the wage to $15 by 2028. So not just for our general economy, not just to do right by workers as a whole, but to do right by the essential workers who we relied on during these difficult years of the pandemic. We really need to raise our minimum wage to at least $12 an hour in July and to $15 by 2028. Let's move on to general fund spending as a whole, and then I'm going to turn this over to Diana. Next slide. As I mentioned, the governor's proposing a $43.7 billion budget. As you can see, there have been big increases in the last 2 years. And again, as I pointed out, that's mostly pandemic-related spending. We expect these increases would level off at the level of spending the governor's proposing in this current budget. The next slide shows you the breakdown of general fund spending. As usual, you can see that the two biggest parts of the budget are pre-K-12 education, which makes up 36% of the budget, and medical assistance, which is what we call Medicaid in the state, and long-term living programs paid for by Medicaid, which is 26% of the budget. Other human services are 16%, criminal justice 6%, higher education is only 4%, and then there's all other departments get 7%. So with that general overview of the budget, I'm going to stop here and turn it over to Diana, and she's going to walk you through some of the details in a few different parts of the budget. Thanks very much.
All right, thanks so much, Mark, and thanks everyone for joining us. So, as Mark said, I'm going to walk you through some of the governor's key proposals with a particular focus on education and human services, and then, I'll get into a couple of other areas of spending. If you could go to the next slide. So as the previous slide had showed with the pie chart, funding for education is a large part of the state's general fund. Governor Wolf has gone big with his proposal for education funding this year. He proposes a 15% increase in pre-K-12 education spending for a total $15.6 billion education budget. There are two big proposals the governor is making this year, including a $1.25 billion increase in basic education funding and a $300 million increase through a new program started last year called Level Up, which essentially puts additional funding into the 100 most underfunded schools in the state. Next slide. So the last figure showed all of pre-K-12 education funding, but we also like to look specifically at what we call K-12 Classroom Funding, or the funding that will go directly to classrooms and excluding things like pensions and transportation. So this figure shows the yearly change in funding from year to year in classroom funding. So as you can see here in orange, the large decrease in funding during Governor Corbett's education cuts, and that was in year 2011-12. You can also see how significant Governor Wolf's proposal is this year, which is in light blue. Next slide. So as many of you know, in 2015, the legislature, knowing Pennsylvania education funding distribution was unfair, enacted a new method of distributing state aid to school districts, what we call the fair funding formula. And this formula takes into account each district's distinct needs. So it takes into account the number of students, those living in poverty, the number of English language learners, the relative wealth of the district, But not all funding goes through the formula. Only new money allocated to K-12 education since 2015. So in this figure, you can see the light blue part of the bars, and that's the amount of school funding being distributed in a fair way through the fair funding formula. This year, you can see a much larger share would go through the formula than in previous years. It would be about 26.5% of funds. And I think, if you include the level up, 30% of funds would be distributed in a more fair way. Next slide. So we know that Pennsylvania needs additional funding to adequately fund our schools. We need an additional estimated $4.1 billion. And as many of you have probably been following, there's currently a court case that has just wrapped up making this case. And this figure, divides up Pennsylvania's 500 school districts into 4 quartiles or groups, each group with a near equal number of students educated within those school districts. The groups are organized by school district with the highest share of students in poverty, which are the bars on the left side of the figure, to those with the lowest share of student poverty, which are the bars to the right. So as you can see with the orange bars, school districts with the highest share of student poverty have the largest per student gap in funding needed to provide an adequate education. Even school districts with the lowest share of student poverty has a gap, but it is obviously much smaller. So what would this year's education funding plan do to our unfair funding system? The blue bars represent the per student funding gap that would exist if Governor Wolf's proposal this year was enacted. And this figure shows it wouldn't fully solve the problem, but it does lessen the disparities. The highest poverty districts would see the largest reduction in their funding gap. Next slide. So this figure is similar to the previous one, but it's organized by the share of Black students in school districts. So those school districts with the highest share of Black students are the bars on the left, and those with the lowest share are on the right. And we see the same trend here. Under Governor Wolf's plan, the funding gap lessens for all school districts, but those with the highest share of Black students would see the greatest decline in the existing funding gap. And while we know this plan doesn't get Pennsylvania all the way to equitable funding, it would take us part of the way there. Next slide. So this year, the governor also proposes a 16% increase in special education funding. And as this figure shows, this would be a significant increase, but it's also a much needed one. School districts, as many of you know, are mandated by state and federal law to cover the cost of special education for students who need it. But the need for special education services has grown while state funding has not kept up. And it's put enormous strain on local school districts to cover the costs. So without more state support and to cover these growing costs, school districts often have to raise property taxes or cut other programs that aren't mandatory. Next slide. There's a couple other proposals that Governor Wolf makes this year related to K-12 education. This year, he proposes charter school reform, which will in total save the state $373 million per year. The first reform is creating a uniform cyber charter tuition rate. Currently, cyber charters charge school districts anywhere between $8,000 and $36,000 per student per year, which is a huge range. And this is much more than the typical tuition charged by intermediate units for online education, which only charge about $5,400 per student per year. So the governor proposes to have the cyber charter tuition rate be set at $9,800. And in total, that would save Pennsylvania about $199 million a year. The second reform is standardizing the special education funding formula for charter schools. So charter school tuition payments are calculated in an out-of-date fashion that assumes charter schools have a special education population of around 16%. And it's a percentage that's often inflated and does not take into account the level of services these students need. And so this creates kind of an odd financial incentive for charter schools to enroll special education students who require fewer, less intensive services. Public schools, on the other hand, have a 3-tiered special education funding formula. So the more services a student needs, the greater the funding a school district will receive for educating that student. So this change will make sure charter schools abide by the same 3-tiered formula. And this change is expected to save Pennsylvania about $174 million a year. Another change the governor is proposing, we've seen in previous years, is increasing the minimum teacher compensation. Currently, this minimum is set to a 1980s level at $18,500 a year. So the governor proposes to increase this to $45,000 to be able to attract and retain quality teachers across the state. Next slide. Governor Wolf this year proposes a $70 million increase in PreK funding. This is an increase of 22.5%, and this includes $60 million in additional funds for pre-K counts and $10 million more for the Head Start Supplemental Assistance Program. For pre-K counts, the funding will go towards a rate increase for full-time and part-time slots, which will support the workforce and providers. This also funds an additional 2,300 slots for Pennsylvania's families. Next slide. So I'm going to walk through the governor's proposal for higher education funding. And if you go to the next slide, I'll provide a little bit of context for this. So Pennsylvania severely underfunds higher education. This figure, is hard to see, but it ranks all the states by state per capita investment in higher education. And way down at the bottom, you'll see Pennsylvania, which is the short orange bar at the bottom of the figure. Pennsylvania ranks 47th in the nation and spends about half per capita on higher education than the national average. Next slide. So the impact of such low state investment is higher tuition. And we know this tuition burden is some of the worst in the nation for all of our students. Pennsylvania has the worst tuition burden in the nation for whites, Blacks, and Latinos. And as you can see, Black students have the highest tuition burden in Pennsylvania, with the net price of public four-year universities costing 56% of the median household income for that population. Next slide. This year, Governor Wolf proposes a $171 million increase for higher education, which would be a 9.6% increase, and that does not include American Rescue Plan funds. As you can see, funding for higher ed hasn't been this high since before the Corbett cuts in 2011-12, and with ARP funding, funding for higher education would increase even more, which is a welcome change. Next slide. A couple other proposals that the governor makes. The governor proposes $200 million in Nellie Bly scholarships for students attending a community college or a state system school. And this would be paid for in part through the Racehorse Development Fund and partly with ARP funds. This year, Governor Wolf proposes a $75 million increase in funding for PASHE after being flat funded at $477 million for the last 3 years. In addition, PASHE has received a commitment of $200 million in ARP funds. $50 million has already been allocated, and $150 million will be allocated next year to help with the planned mergers. And under Governor Wolf's plan, community colleges and Pennsylvania state-related universities would see a 5% increase if their budgets, if this budget is enacted. One other initiative the governor is proposing is a $1 million in funding to address college hunger on campuses across the state, and these would be distributed as grants. Next slide. So I'm going to walk you through some of the key proposals related to the human services budget. There's a lot to this budget, so I'm not going to talk about everything in detail, but I encourage people to look at the budget analysis, which has a lot more details here. Next slide. So the governor proposed an $18.3 billion budget for human services. This is an increase of 21.8% from the previous year. And as you can see in this figure, more than 3/4 of human services spending goes to medical assistance, long-term living, and intellectual disabilities. Next slide. So long-term care facilities have been strained by the pandemic. Workforce shortages have gotten worse, and there's an increased need for stronger regulations and increased staffing ratios. So the governor's proposed a $91 million increase in state funds for medical assistance rates for skilled nursing facilities. And this funding will allow facilities to begin hiring staff to implement increased staffing ratios, changes in next year's regulations. Personal care homes, these are residencies that provide shelter, meals, and assistance with personal care tasks for older people or those with a disability. These homes have been closing in Pennsylvania in recent years at a rapid rate, especially those that support low-income individuals. So the governor's proposing $50 million for supplementary payments for personal care homes. The governor also proposes $32.3 million, about around 19 million of which, are state funds to support individuals with intellectual disabilities and autism. And with this funding, 732 individuals will be able to move from the wait list to the community living waiver program, and 100 individuals to the consolidated waiver program. And these programs help individuals live more independently in their homes and communities. Next slide. So in this year's budget, the governor focuses on additional investments in childcare using federal and state dollars. This includes federal dollars to increase the reimbursement rate and to reduce the copayment for families using the Child Care Works program. There's also federal funding for expanding the hours of childcare for families that work, outside of a 9-to-5 schedule. And using state funds, this year the governor proposes a new childcare model for state workers. Next slide. So the governor proposes a $14.3 million increase for SNAP benefits for low-income adults and adults with disabilities. This program supports between 75,000 and 95,000 eligible older adults and adults with disabilities. And this would increase payments from $20 per month to $35 per month. The governor is proposing $36.6 million increase in funding for county mental health services. And on substance use disorder treatment, in the year 2020, we saw an increase in overdose deaths in Pennsylvania. The governor is proposing $15 million as stabilization payments to substance use disorder treatment providers. Next slide. So there's one notable thing missing in the governor's budget, and that's that there are no increases in the TANF grant amounts. We know that TANF grants are critical to Pennsylvania's lowest income families, but the grant amount has remained the same since 1990. It's about $403 for a family of 3, which amounts to only around 21% of the already low federal poverty level. There are 24 other states that have increased their TANF grant amount since 2013, and the median grant amount of all states is significantly higher than Pennsylvania at $498 a month. Surrounding states have higher grant amounts, including West Virginia, whose grant amount is now at $542 a month. So we spend way too little of our state and federal TANF dollars on actual grants to low-income families, which is really what the legislation was intended to do. Pennsylvania only spends 12% of their TANF funds on grants compared to the national average of 22%. So it's our take that the governor and the General Assembly should increase these grant amounts. As caseloads have decreased over the years, we should have enough savings to pay for a substantial increase in grant levels. Next slide. Just a couple other things. The governor has proposed staffing increases for several departments. This includes increases in staff for DHS and the Department of Aging. And also, I just wanted to say a word about the Department of Health. You know, the COVID public health crisis has exposed, you know, a lot of inadequacies in our public health infrastructure. Nationally, we know that spending for state public health departments has fallen by 18% since 2010. Pennsylvania spends about $39 per capita on public health, and it's 7th from the bottom among all states. We are just one of 10 states that spend less than $50 per person on public health, which left us in a difficult position when COVID hit. This year, the governor proposes an 8% increase in the Department of Health. $4 million will go to enhance the public health workforce so we can better respond to large-scale public health emergencies. And $7.2 million will go to better support the county and municipal health departments in Pennsylvania. Next slide. Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about criminal justice. If you could go on to the next slide. So Pennsylvania spends significant funding on incarceration. As we showed in the pie chart earlier, you know, the Department of Corrections is now the 3rd largest department in the state budget. This figure shows that state funding for incarceration surpassed state funding for higher education in 2011-12 after the Corbett cuts. And since then, funding for higher education has remained relatively flat while funding for corrections has been increasing. Next slide. There's a couple initiatives the governor proposes related to criminal justice and policing. The governor's proposing $141 million be used from the general fund to fund Pennsylvania State Police. Currently, the state takes about $600 million from the motor license fund to support state police. So this investment from the general fund will reduce the reliance on the motor license fund, which will free up money needed for bridge and road repairs. The governor is proposing $35 million in grants and technical assistance to support community-led gun violence prevention efforts. Last year and this year, the governor is proposing some other criminal justice reforms. One is probation reform, reducing the time in supervision in some instances. We know that Pennsylvania actually has a high probation rate. 1 in 34 adults are under some sort of community supervision in our state compared to 1 in 53 adults nationwide. The governor also proposes monetary cash bail and pre-trial reforms, reducing the amount of time those accused of crimes spend in jail pre-trial. The governor also proposes $1 million for re-entry services for women and $7 million to DHS to create beds for individuals leaving a state correctional facility with complex needs. This would support medical release for eligible inmates, including the elderly, so that they can continue their care in appropriate long-term care facilities. Next slide. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about the climate and environment. As the next slide shows, and I like to show this when we talk about, you know, the Department of Environmental Protection. Our Constitution, Pennsylvania Constitution, actually gives us the right to clean air and water. Our Constitution states the people have a right to clean air, pure water, and to the preservation of the natural, scenic, historic, and aesthetic values of the environment. Pennsylvania's public natural resources are the common property of the people, including generations yet to come. As trustee of these resources, the Commonwealth shall conserve and maintain them for the benefit of all people. Next slide. So this figure shows kind of all the funding for the Department of Environmental Protection, including federal funds for both 2021-22 and the upcoming year that are proposed by the governor. As you can see, the funds proposed by Governor Wolf this year are significantly higher than last year. The governor proposes a $211 million general fund budget for DEP, which is a 25% increase. The governor proposes a $5 million increase for program and operational needs within DEP, and this would create 41 new positions within the department that would, these individuals would focus on, clean air, waterways, and wetlands management. And this is incredibly important because DEP's staff has been gutted over the last 2 decades, and if we're serious about protecting our environment, we must invest in the staff to carry out the mission. The governor proposes increased funding for the water commissions this year, so the commissions would be funded at full share funding this year. And these commissions, like the Susquehanna River Basin Commission, the Ohio River Valley Water Sanitation Commission, these commissions are important to ensuring water quality and the ability to monitor that. The Department of Environmental Protection would also see significant increases in federal funds, including through the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which would bring in about $118 million. And that is broken down in our report. Some of those funds will be used for assistance to small and disadvantaged communities, to plug orphan wells, for abandoned mine reclamation. But all of that is outlined in our report. And with that, I think that wraps up my portion of the presentation. Thanks again for joining us, and I'll turn it back over to Marc for some final words.
Thanks, Diana. I just want to kind of give you a final overview. You've seen our comprehensive look at the state budget today. I'm sure it's somewhat overwhelming. You can look at our almost 60-page report, which is now posted on the web, hold on just a second. You'll be able to, you can look at our 60-page report to review what we said today and get additional details. And this year we'll be launching a series of what we call Know the Issues pages, where we break down the budget into bite-sized pieces. Look for that in the next couple of weeks, and that'll give you a chance to review some of the detail here and learn a little bit more about particular areas of the budget that especially interest you. We'll also be putting out a number of reports over the next few months on parts of the budget. We'll have a paper on the corporate tax system coming out in the next 2 weeks. There'll be additional papers on the earned income tax credit, which we support, on our fair share tax plan, and on many other areas of the budget, particularly with regard to human service spending. But to summarize what we said here today, we have a huge surplus. Even with spending everything the government wants to spend in this budget, we will still have a huge surplus at the end of next year. Funds are available without raising taxes to meet some of the unmet demands for K-12 and higher education, environmental protection, human services. And that means this year is the time to act. It's time for the General Assembly to stop hoarding money and to use that money to benefit the people of Pennsylvania. The budget process starts with the governor, and it's ultimately decided by the General Assembly acting with the governor. But we, the people, can be part of the budget process as well. We will be giving you opportunities through Pennsylvania Budget and Policy Center and through our advocacy campaign, We the People, PA, to weigh in on the state budget, to ask legislators to do the right thing, to tell them and demand to do the right thing, demand they do the right thing, to give them specific instructions about what we the people want. We hope you will take advantage of those opportunities, because I'll be honest with you, those things do make a difference. The ultimate shape of the budget, how much new education funding we have, how much funding we have for higher education, whether we meet some of the unmet demand for new spending in human services, depends not just on what our legislators want, not just on what the governor wants, but on what you want and what you're prepared to do to make sure that the legislators know what you want. So please look for those opportunities to take action. And with that, we'll stop and take a couple of questions.
Thanks so much, Marc. Thanks so much, Diana. This has been really wonderful and really eye-opening for those of us on the team who have just gotten the opportunity to really look at this report and go through it with you. We have received a number of questions via the chat. We still are taking questions, so if folks would like to submit a question, you can just drop that in chat, either as a message to everyone, or you can just private message it to me if you'd like. First question we have, though, is from Marion, whose question is about what budget category would be for roads and bridges? What category of budget is that?
We didn't really talk about that today, as you know, but there's a section in the budget analysis about it. It's not an easy question to answer because most roads and bridges at the state level flows through PennDOT, but PennDOT is funded from a number of sources. Diana, do you want to say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, the budget that the governor released, the general fund budget that has, you know, kind of all of his line items for the general fund, doesn't tell you a lot about the Department of Transportation, because I think general funds make up only 0.1% of transportation funding. So yeah, I would point you to our section on transportation, which is towards the end of the report. Most of the funds are coming from federal dollars or the motor license fund. That makes up more than half of the funding for PennDOT.
Thanks so much, Mark and Diana. Just so folks know, I just dropped the link in the chat to the budget analysis. That's on our website now. That was released this morning as we began this presentation. You can find that information there. A number of other questions we have coming in. There is a question from Noni who would like to know, is there an increase or perhaps a decrease in the corrections budget for fiscal year 2023?
Yeah, so that's also in our analysis. The governor proposes a $2.78 billion Department of Corrections budgets, and that's an increase of 4.1% over last year.
Great. Thank you so much for the question, Noni. Thank you, Diana, for addressing that. We have a question from Sandra. Is there a number for the total dollars needed by the state to increase the salary for K-12 teachers to at least $45,000? Basically, what's the total amount that would cost to do that?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's something that I'll have to check the budget book for, and I don't know offhand.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, go ahead, Mark.
I'll say a word on that. Because the teacher salaries are paid by local school districts, that number won't show up in the state budget. It'll show up in the individual school district budgets. And I don't know that we have any numbers on how many school teachers are below $45,000 in salary and how far below, so to figure out how much more it would cost. It is clear, though, that the governor's huge increase in basic education funding proposed in this budget would more than cover any increase in teacher salaries and do much else as well. So I don't think there's an issue with there being enough money for local school districts. But it's a really interesting question, Sandra, and we'll try to see what we can find.
Yes, thanks so much, Sandra. A very thought-provoking question. I'd be very interested to see what that number looks like. Probably a lot of research to go into that, so we'll see what we can do. Another question from Noni. Are there any programs to encourage and or support affordable housing in the state budget proposal?
Mark, I don't know if you have any information on this. I mean, I know through the Brighter PA proposal, the governor is proposing a property tax rebate program that will support both homeowners and renters. I don't know what else in the state budget, if you have any thoughts on that.
I mean, that is the major program that's already existing and that the governor proposes to expand. There are a number of programs that the governor or the state provides support for building affordable housing. It's not a huge amount of money. It's far less than is needed. We are working on a paper on housing assistance that will address some of the things we think should be done to expand housing assistance. It's actually not something that the state does enough on. It's something where we really need much more state action in a number of different ways. Now, and housing affordability is actually multiple issues. There's the issue of homelessness. There's the issue of rents being too high in too many places. There's the issue of people not having money to make down payments. And there are lots of different programs that are needed to address what is becoming a housing crisis. There's the issue of gentrification in many of our cities, driving people out of neighborhoods. As Lavana points out in the chat, we're going to do a workshop on housing and rental assistance soon. But this is a topic we are more and more interested in. We have a big paper coming out in a couple of weeks, and we'll be doing more work on it soon. I think this is a future policy area that the state must be addressing in a way it hasn't in the past.
Thanks so much for that question and for addressing that, Mark. And as Lavana noted there, and I was going to mention this, exactly 2 weeks from today at 1 p.m., we have an entire workshop on housing and rental assistance with a number of experts in housing policy joining us for that. So those of you who are interested in learning more about the housing crisis in Pennsylvania and possible solutions will want to be with us 2 weeks from today in the afternoon for that session. Getting a number of other questions here, so we'll move quickly through these. Question from Matt: can the General Assembly change the federally allocated spending for DEA or other PA budget categories?
Diana, do you want to take that?
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that.
In general, some federal funding is dedicated for specific purposes. Some can be used for a variety of purposes. For example, Medicaid funding just goes to Medicaid. The TANF program, on the other hand, the state can use for a number of different purposes, for childcare or for providing grants for people. One of the things we've been arguing is that more money should be provided to low-income individuals and families through the TANF program. It varies so much from one area to another that it's very hard to say, answer in general. With regard to transportation, in many cases, the state has to match federal funding to draw down federal money. So and of course with Medicaid, we have to create the program and state has to provide its funding. Other areas, the federal government just gives us money and we spend it. So there's no general rule. It varies so much from one area to another. And I don't know specifically about DEA funding. I'd have to look it up.
Thanks for your question, Matt. And thank you, Mark, for addressing that. Question from Kevin, who notes that the new money for education goes through the fair funding formula. Has anyone taken all existing money and put through the fair funding formula and then proposed new funding as to make the whole amount for those that we lose? Would it shift the burden of winning new funding from those most in need to those who benefit from historical unfairness? So the question's about what would happen if we put all the money through the fair funding formula. How much is that?
So there are lots of ways to distribute education funding. What the governor's doing is not putting all the money through the formula. He's putting some money through the formula and then $300 million through the Level Up program, which dedicates funding to the school districts that are most underfunded. I think the premise of the question is quite right. We have historically funded schools in a very unfair way. The base of funding that goes through the BEF is set by the way funding was distributed in 2014, 2015, which followed almost 20 years with out of funding formula and a very unfair distribution. That's why we're very supportive of the proposal, not just to put more money through the funding formula, but to dedicate funding to school districts that are historically unfunded. It's theoretically possible just to say, okay, we're going to run all the money through the formula. That does create some problems, however. It's what the governor proposed last year, but then he proposed, but we don't want anyone to lose, so there's an extra money for those who might lose. And there was one question the governor never answered. What do you do from this in year two? If all the money is going through the formula changes amounts from year to year, and that would mean some school districts would see really great shifts from year to year. And that makes planning, if you're a school district, very, very difficult. So the idea of putting all the money through the formula and leaving that as how we do education funding, while it sounds immediately attractive, actually is not over the long term. But clearly, it's very, very important that as we increase school funding, we put a lot more money to underfunded districts so that we get to the point where the historical inequities are overcome, and then new money through the funding formula will be totally appropriate.
Thanks for your question, Kevin, and Mark, thanks for addressing that. Certainly a lot of big challenges facing the way we fund our education in Pennsylvania. Question from Jerry. With the opioid crisis and drug overdose deaths increasing, especially in the African-American communities, where is the money to address this crisis?
Jerry, that's a great question and a great point. The one thing that I came across on this issue is, a $15 million additional investment that will go to substance use disorder treatment providers. And I can look specifically at the budget as well to see if there's any other specific programs aimed at that population, or if that's that's definitely what was highlighted by the governor as a change this year.
Thank you for addressing that, Diana.
And let me add something. I just want to, Jerry, there is a serious problem in the African-American community, but there's a serious opioid problem and drug overdose death problem in the white community and the rural community. In fact, in the last few years, opioid deaths have been growing much faster in rural white communities than in urban Black communities. And I mention that just because I think it's important in terms of advocating on this issue that we don't overly racialize the problem. It's a problem connected to poverty. It's a problem connected to a lack of economic opportunity. And we see the same kind of problems in rural communities as we do in urban communities and Black and white communities. And I think it's really important that we recognize the ubiquity of the problem and how it affects so many people all over the state, because that's going to help us build the political power to invest more money in it. It's something the governor has done a lot about in recent years. He's called for a special session of the legislature to address it. I don't think we're doing enough yet, but there has been more effort. And I think one way we kind of enhance that effort is by making sure people understand that this is a problem that affects everyone, no matter what you look like, where you live.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks, Diana. And thank you, Jerry, as well. Obviously, a serious crisis facing Pennsylvania in all parts of the state. Couple comments here. Michael notes that in Westmoreland County, working families pay $500 more per month, I think in rent and utilities, than actually owning a home. Sandra also notes and says, great presentation again, truly appreciate your yearly review. I don't see any more questions in the chat. We'll give an opportunity if somebody wants to squeeze in a quick question there. I think we have time for one more. And then there are a couple things we want to do here to wrap up and look forward and ahead to the other events we've got coming up today as part of the budget summit.
Let me just say something to Michael's point. Sure. One of the problems we've seen is that it's very hard for young people to raise the funds to make a down payment for a home. It's harder than it used to be. The interesting thing is home ownership actually has not been increasing. The cost of home ownership has not been increasing as fast because, at least up until recently, interest rates have been so low that the carrying costs of a home are often lower than rent. But you still need the money to come up with the down payment. We've been talking internally about doing a report to find some policy ideas that would help young people get funds for a down payment for a house, so as to overcome just the problem you're talking about. We think this would address not only intergenerational inequity, but racial inequity, because, as you know, in the Black community, because of redlining and other factors, Black people haven't been able to create enough wealth, intergenerational wealth, that they can use to help kids get a down payment for their homes. So that's a really serious problem, and we're thinking about some policy solutions, and I hope that's one of the papers we put out over the next couple of months. So thanks for that important question.
Thanks so much, Mark. I think we have two or three questions here to wrap up. One we received from folks in the Zoom events lobby, where you can actually watch these sessions without actually joining in the room here. So we have a lot more folks, I think, watching us there from the lobby. But the question we've received there is, and it's a little bit of background here, there's a proposed $11.8 million increase for libraries. However, we are still operating at less than 60% of our funding from 2007, before it was cut in half in 2008. This increase does not come close to meeting that need. We've been forced to try to address increasing need with dwindling resources for over a decade. We must rely heavily on the already overburdened local economy for donations. We provide career workforce development, connection to social services, early literacy, lifelong learning, and act as community centers for our patrons. We work closely with schools to help them meet their mandates despite their limited funding. We're also essential sources for support for our homeschoolers. Here in rural areas in particular, public libraries provide Wi-Fi and other technical services that are inadequate, especially during remote learning times. So the question then is, what is your analysis of this small increase?
Our analysis is your analysis. It's
okay.
It's way too small. We did not do a section on the libraries this year, I don't believe. We have in the past. But that's something we should probably be looking at to do more in the future. The 2008 cut was horrible, and we have not restored it. And libraries, you know, I'm a kid who grew up in the library, like a lot of folks. It's a critical resource for many people for many different ways, as you point out, and we're just not spending enough.
Thank you, Leah, for that question, and Marc for addressing that. And obviously, lifelines libraries are critical lifelines for many folks in terms of learning, education, and all kinds of opportunities. So thank you to all of our librarians across Pennsylvania for doing a really important and tough job. Final question here from Michael. It's a quick one. Are there rent-to-own or rehabilitate-to-own programs in Pennsylvania?
I answered in the chat, I do not know.
Okay.
There should be. It's one of those ideas I said we're thinking of analyzing and making a proposal for. I'll tell you one thing, there's a really great program in Philadelphia, a private program. A developer named Ken Weinstein has been training people in the community to do housing rehabs, to basically become small-scale developers to redevelop homes in low and moderate income communities. I've knocked doors in a lot of such communities, and there's a housing stock, not just in Philadelphia, but in every small city in the state, and many rural areas, that is of quality that will never be built again in this country unless a lot of things change. Those houses deserve to be rehabbed and restored and become homes for another 4, 5, or 6 generations of Pennsylvanians. So that's the kind of programs that we want to look at, and we're going to be, our paper will be calling for some major investments in them. So thank you for pointing that out again.
Thanks, Michael, and thanks for addressing that, Marc. And as somebody who lives in that community where Ken Weinstein has this really innovative and interesting program, it's been really exciting to see the effects of that, and folks who are actually moving into and owning their own homes that they've been fixing up. And anyway, just wanted to note that. We are at the end of our time here for this session. I want to thank so much PBPC Director Marc Stier and our Senior Policy Analyst Diana Polson for an excellent presentation today. Again, this is an overview of the budget analysis that we just released this morning. It is on the PBPC website. We've dropped the link in the chat there a few times. You can also just go to our website and find that. If you arrived late and missed some of the beginning of this session, you can go immediately over to the PBPC Facebook page, where we have the video has been streaming. You can watch whatever part you missed again at the beginning. There will be opportunities for folks to for folks to catch up on any sessions that they miss coming up in the Budget Summit. Speaking of coming up, we are taking a break right now for lunch. We're not going to try to keep everybody online for 8 or 9 hours straight on Zoom. I think that would be overly taxing for all of us. So we are going to take a break, but we will be coming back at 1 p.m. And you will want to join us here at 1 p.m. Promptly, because we will be heading into the keynote address of the Pennsylvania Budget and Policy Center's 2021 Budget Summit. We are very excited to have joining us here today Senator Vincent Hughes, always a great orator, and he will be focusing on the theme of the summit, which is Advancing Democracy for Pennsylvania's Future. Again, join us at 1 p.m. There will be time for question and answer there, and that session goes from 1 to 2:15 p.m. We'll also be giving you in that session a preview of what we have coming up for the next 3 Thursdays in the afternoon when we continue the summit. And we're very excited to tell you about all the workshops coming up ahead. As we conclude now, I want to again thank Marc and Diana, but I also want to thank everyone on the PBPC team who have been working so hard over the last number of weeks to put together this event, and a lot of folks taking on all kinds of behind the scenes roles to try to make sure that our tech works as smoothly as possible. So we do want to thank everybody on the PBPC team who've been a part of this session this morning. Again, thank you all for joining us. Join us back here at 1 p.m. for the keynote address by Senator Vincent Hughes. Everyone have a great afternoon. Take care.